Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Millennials Are Old podcast, where we remember it because you're getting old, your brain sucks, and frankly, your dick and pussy don't work. And speaking of people whose dicks don't work, let's get
Both of
into
them.
the yes, exactly. And speaking of once again, people people whose dicks don't work, let's get into the 1967 classic Bonnie and Clyde. Now, Brian, this was your choice for this episode. Why did you want to choose Bonnie and Clyde for us to review?
So, as of recording, it is February 2nd, and I'm doing a separate project for the first 2 weeks of February leading up to Valentine's Day. And that sort of aligned with, my last choice for the podcast was Born Losers. And they're both movies that are considered kind of pivotal in the rise of what's considered sort of like the late 60s, early 70s, kind of like new, like rebellion auteur kind of movement in American cinema. Although, well, they're both pivotal in that, obviously Bonnie and Clyde is a lot more celebrated of a movie, but they came out the same year. They have pretty wildly different themes, but they appeal to a lot of the same tendencies in, I think, the boomer audience that they resonated with. And because it lined up with this other project I'm working on for the month, I thought it would be a good selection for Millennials Are Old because it's again, this is another movie that is not a millennial movie. This is a boomer movie that I think, for many decades it was talked about a lot and then kind of becomes a passe movie, but it's really pivotal in the development of, plot lines and tropes that we see many decades going on. And I just don't, you don't see a lot of millennials or younger, or even really Gen Xers talk about it as much as you used to. So I thought it would be good for the series.
Yes, very much so. And this is actually my first time watching this movie. Before you recommended it, I had never seen or even heard of this specific movie, to be honest. I probably heard it referenced in, in hindsight, but I just don't frankly
Just
remember
thought
it.
process. Yeah.
Exactly. But this is a movie that you talked about being very influential. This is very influential because this was, even though, and I think we talked about this a little bit in the Born Losers episode, even though this movie did technically still, or was still being made and was released during the Hays Code was still very much on its way out and was pretty much defunct by the time this movie came out. So there were a lot of things in this movie that didn't that were not shown in movies for decades prior that you now
Yeah.
see. And it's very impressive to see in color with actors that I recognize. And it's something that it's like, oh, wow, an old movie that actually is willing to show the consequences of what is shown on screen instead of comes across as, no pun intended, but impotent, like a lot of movies released in the 40s,
Yeah.
50s, and early 60s.
This film is one of the first films to use blood squibs as they existed for many decades. The little seals that you attach to an actor that exploded to create the effect of them getting shot. This is one of the first films to utilize that.
Yes, and it was also one of the first movies to show actual like consequences of people being shot and dying too in modern cinema.
Yeah, to see people dying like a painful death and not having, not dying by kind of falling asleep and tumbling down with their eyes closed, the
Yeah,
Western as existed in, American films in the 40s and 50s.
yeah. As I mentioned earlier, that this movie's not, once again, no pun intended, but is not impotent in showing the actual consequences of the action. So, like, a movie in the 50s would show somebody dying, but it would be a guy like having his arms raised up and going ah, and then like dying. It would be like really stupid and goofy bullshit. But this movie is not stupid and goofy for the most part.
Yeah, this movie, what I'm really interested in looking at it, so I've seen this movie before, but not for many years. When I was, a preteen, I was really into like gangster movies and like early film noir stuff. So I rented this movie from my school, well, not from my school library, from my hometown library. I had it ordered and sent from a bigger city in our library system, and I watched it a few times because I was just before I really got into music and stuff, I was really into this old movie, and for really into gangsters and old crime films. So I had seen this since then. I don't think I was aware that it was influential because I had read that. So, you read when you're a kid, you read things and you think like, oh, Bonnie and Clyde is influential because it's an early violent film and it's an anti-authority film and it's counterculture. But you maybe don't have a lot of firsthand understanding for what that means. You know it because you've read it. Whereas now watching it, you really see a lot of things. And I have to say, this movie, and I don't think I appreciated it as a kid, it feels really contemporary for how old it is.
It very much does. It very much does. I will totally agree with that. But yes, let's get into some details here. So speaking of contemporary, once again, as Brian mentioned earlier, it was released in 1967, was rated R, although at the time of release, it was not rated R because the modern MPAA rating system was actually first formulated the year after in November of 1968, but was retroactively given an R rating, which is not surprising, obviously. This movie was directed by Arthur Penn. It was written by David Newman and Robert Benton, and it was produced by Clyde himself, Warren Beatty. Arthur Penn is most known for writing or directing the films The Miracle Worker, which is a movie about Helen Keller, which is a movie I actually saw in school. I did not realize he directed that. This movie, of course, and he also directed the film Alice's Restaurant, which is another critically acclaimed film. David Newman is most known for writing this movie, of course. The first three Superman movies, he didn't write Superman 4, unfortunately, otherwise known as the best Superman movie. And he wrote the story segment for Smooth Criminal for the Michael Jackson movie Moonwalker. Yeah, isn't that crazy?
I did not know that.
I mean, arguably Michael Jackson's best song and best music, and arguably his best music video outside of maybe Thriller, of course.
There's a lot of competition there, but interesting. He probably got that work because he, of course, wrote an entire film about two smooth criminals.
Yes, very. Robert. Yeah. Robert Benton is most well known for directing and or writing for several movies such as Bad Company, from the album Bad Company, the song Bad Company, and the band Bad Company. No, I'm just kidding. It's just writing the movie Bad Company. Yeah. He also wrote, I believe he wrote the movie Kramer versus Kramer, which is I believe an Academy Award winning film. Places in the Heart.
Just sounds so upsetting, and
it is very depressing. Movie Billy Bathgate, Nobody's Fool, The Human Stain, and the first Superman movie. So this guy had a very, very laudable, critically acclaimed, and commercially successful career himself. Now, Warren Beatty, the producer, is a Hollywood legend, and as we mentioned earlier with Tom Laughlin, is another commonality that this movie has with, with Born Losers, that Warren Beatty is also a based lib, as we all know, especially if you've ever seen the film Bulworth.
And this is, so I need to watch Bulworth. I know that you've actually Taylor has been telling me about Bulworth, again, kind of like I think with Gamer, for the length of our friendship, but in a different way.
Now, to be fair, if anybody is a fan of this podcast, I did review Bulworth for my other podcast, Dick Proles, with Evan and an old friend, Olivia. Now, that I fucking love Bulworth. Like, straight up, Bulworth is one of my favorite movies. It is so fucking good. It is a movie that is, pun intended, tailor-made. It is tailor-made for me. It is a movie that is just, every scene is incredible. I laughed at every fucking scene in that movie. It's great.
Maybe I'll watch it tonight.
It's actually on the drive if you want to watch it. So,
okay.
He also, go ahead, Brian.
Oh, one of the Warren Beatty, the baselines thing too, is like, this is actually a movie that probably, as much as Bulworth, especially for the time, this is a movie that is very reflective of that part of his personality. A lot of it, because it's about the folklore version, the mythic version of Bonnie and Clyde, and it's pretty realistic, but it definitely leans in a self-aware way on like the idea of them as folk heroes, of like kind of like Robin Hood types, even though, and we'll get into that later, that's murkier than the movie makes it.
Yeah, it's not like Al Capone, who actually did do a certain amount of philanthropy. Like, I don't think that Bonnie and Clyde probably did that much philanthropy or were really much of Bonnie and Clyde figures.
We get into there as we get into the scenes, it's a little more complicated than that.
Yes.
But I wouldn't say they did philanthropy. That's not the word I would use.
Yeah, oh, very much, I guess. But yes, he is known for directing, producing, writing, or acting, because he did all that. And such films as, once again, Bonnie and Clyde, Shampoo, which is a movie that I have on Blu-ray, but I have not watched. Heaven Can Wait, the movie that he won, I believe, 3 Oscars for, the biopic Reds, which is a movie about a journalist during the Russian Revolution, I believe.
Yeah, Reds is about John Reed and Louise Bryant. I actually have never seen it because I really enjoy both of their writing. They're kind of foundational for me. Louise Bryant particularly wrote a lot about like applying Marxism and Stalinism to art, into like education and how to teach kids about art.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, it just seems weird to me that like Beatty and Diane Keaton, I think, played them in a movie. And it's just kind of strange. So I've never watched the movie, but I probably will someday. Maybe
Oh,
it's
I
fine.
will too. I've heard it's very good. He also directed and starred in the movie Dick Tracy, which I did not know was also, I believe, won a couple Academy Awards as well.
Should have.
The film Bugsy, once again, Bulworth, fucking classic film. Once again, one of my favorite movies of all time. It's so much fun.
Have you seen Bugsy, by the way? It's good. Just speaking of the base flip thing, have you seen Bugsy?
I have not, no.
Oh, because that's another movie that ties in with that. Highly recommend. Kind of like riding the Goodfellas coattails, but it's very good.
Cool. This is one of his few commercial and critical failures, Ishtar. And then lastly, he's also known for being in the movie Parallax View. Now, I do have to mention, speaking of Parallax View, this is something I do need to mention for the show. Warren Beatty does have a assault allegation of a sexual nature, because I don't want to get shit on by YouTube in case they hear that. From a young lady who claims she was 14 at the time, 14 or 15, and he was 35. During the production of Parallax View, Warren Beatty allegedly groomed her and assaulted her. Now, that is something I did need to say for the show, because obviously it does need to be stated. Now, he's not been convicted either civilly or by jury trial, criminal conviction, anything like that, but it is something we do need to mention for the show, because I would feel a little out of place if I didn't mention it.
Especially someone like Warren Beatty, who a lot of his bones were made on making socially progressive or at least socially conscious films, and being kind of like a new kind of tough guy was how he would build himself. And I think, obviously these are allegations. We don't know what's going to happen with him. But because that's the context that, movie history chooses to look at him at, and probably how we're going to be talking about him in that context, if there's something about that is untrue, that it's important to highlight that. I think that will be a part of talking about his legacy and this movie in particular for me. So, if he's just this asshole and that's bullshit, which it very well could be because he's a fucking actor, then I think that's important to know.
Exactly. So either way, if that stops you from wanting to watch a Warren Beatty film, I totally understand, but it is something that we did need to mention, obviously. Something a little less serious. This movie is 111 minutes long. Movie had a budget of $2.5 million and grossed $70 million, so definitely a box office success. On Rotten Tomatoes, it has an 89% critic score and an 88% audience score, so it's interesting to see critic and audience views be basically matched. That's pretty cool. We don't really see that too often.
Yeah, I think we see it less now too.
Yeah, very much so. Especially back in the day, there was so much of a monoculture that a movie like this, everybody fucking saw.
Yeah. You didn't have as much of not that there weren't alternative or underground films, of course there always were. But when a movie like this came out, that it's objectively it's a very well made movie, and then it's got the trappings of some counterculture or some anti-establishment. I wouldn't go so far as to say leftist, but anti-establishment themes. And it's also a very crowd pleasing movie. Because like I said earlier, it is very much the myth of Bonnie and Clyde. It's not totally, whitewashed, but they're portraying, a very idealized version of them. And, more of that is real than you might think at first. But yeah, no, everyone saw this movie. This is a movie, kind of a highbrow movie that really hit a broad mark, on all, I guess, demographic sectors at the time.
No, for sure.
Another thing you don't see as much now, I would say.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, there are movies that make $2 billion now that like 90% of people have never seen. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like that's a thing that could fucking happen. It's wild, but that is a thing that can definitely happen. And then let's get into some trivia here. So I only put 5 facts because there's like 100 fucking facts on IMDb.
There's
but I
books written about this movie. Like there's.
Yeah, so I just wanted to put a couple on here. So first one listed here is when Warren Beatty was on board as producer only, his sister Shirley MacLaine was a strong possibility to play Bonnie. But when Beatty decided to play Clyde himself, for obvious reasons, he decided not to use his sister.
Yeah, good call. Shirley MacLaine should have been good in that role with Bonnie Parker. I can see that. It would have been different.
No,
but I can see that.
Absolutely. Next fact here is Warner Brothers had so little faith in the film that they offered first-time producer Warren Beatty 40% of the gross instead of a minimal fee. The movie went on to gross over, of course, $70 million. So theoretically, he made about $28 million. And $28 million in 1967-68 money. That's like $500 million nowadays or whatever. Like,
it's funny now too. I mean, it is kind of funny in 2023 to look back and be like, and think that a studio didn't have faith in this. But, you do have to remember that Hays Code's still technically in effect. This is, first of all, the violence in this movie is rough. And this is a movie about outlaws. They're, outlaws historically, obviously in America, beloved. But Hollywood did kind of shy away from making movies like this for about 30 years until this.
No, for sure. I mean, this was the first major film during, definitely near the end of the Hays Code. So yeah, the fact that this movie was as popular as it was with how comparatively violent it was for the time is actually pretty impressive. Because at this point, I actually looked it up. So the Hays Code was basically neutered in the 1962 or 1963. There was a Sidney Lumet movie that featured pretty significant nudity that they actually went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court struck down essentially pretty much all of the Hays Code enforcement at that point. So the Hays Code had already been pretty much neutered by that point, but technically it was still in effect. So yeah. Next fact here. This is the film debut of Gene Wilder. So here's another connection, Brian, that you have with 2 movies in a row. So not only films released in 1967, but both of these movies you have, we've reviewed of your choice, have featured alumni of Washington High School in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Wouldn't it be great if I did that on purpose? Wouldn't it? Should I just pretend that was like a theme?
Yeah, you're like, you know what, Taylor? My favorite book is the 1949 Washington High School yearbook. I just love it so much. I want to put everybody in it. Well,
every graduating class of that year, was in a counterculture film that broke some sort of record in the types of people it saw.
Did I show you the yearbook that had both Gene Wilder and Tom Laughlin in it? I think I sent that to you.
What a couple of kids you did.
It was hilarious shit. Do you think they knew about each other back then and then after they became famous?
Definitely after they became famous. It's funny because, how high schools are, so there's so many people that you go to high school with that you don't really know.
Yeah. But
I'm sure they met or became aware of each other because of that, after they became famous.
Oh, no, for sure. Because I think Gene Wilder is about 1.5 years, 2 years younger than Tom Laughlin. So I doubt they graduated the same year, but they were only a year or 2 apart. So they probably walked past each other in the fucking hallway or something. Just bizarre stuff, really. The actor Michael J. Pollard, who played CW in this movie, didn't realize that in eating scenes, you don't actually eat all the food because of the possibility of repeated takes.
There's always There's always one person in every eating scene, every commentary or book you read about that does that. No.
Sure enough, he soon regretted it in the scene in which the outlaws kidnap a couple and eat their lunch in the car. By the 12th take, Pollard was feeling ill, having had to eat 12 whole hamburgers. Hilarious shit. And the last fact I decided to include on here, Gene Hackman, who played Buck in this movie, was on the set one day when he noticed a guy standing behind him and staring. The man said, quote unquote, "Hell, Buck would have never wore a hat like that." Hackman turned around and looked at him and said, "Maybe not. He looked like an old Texas farmer." The man introduced himself and said, "Nice to meet you. I'm one of the Barrows." So he just interacted with one of fucking Clyde's relatives somewhere. It's just wild stuff. So, I mean, small world shit. I mean, I believe they did shoot this movie in Texas. So, probably could have came across one of these guys by accident.
Well, and I mean, as much as we think of the golden era of gangsters and bank robbers as being mythic, even I think even in the 90s, when I was a small kid, that's how they seemed to me. It really is not that long ago in the span of America. And in the 60s, I mean, you're talking, what, 35 years, 40 years?
Yeah, about 35 years from when they started. Yeah, no, for sure, absolutely. And then speaking of their story, let's get into the synopsis here. Now, the film begins with a very short little clip show of various pictures of Bonnie and Clyde growing up. Over no music, just sound of new pictures coming back and forth. It's kind of cool. It's almost like a projector sound for that.
It's a good opening. It's very, I mean, I think that also gives a good setup to the fact that this is, I'm going to keep saying it because it's important to hammer in. This movie gets a lot of criticism when I was reading up on other people's thoughts, especially in more recent times, for being a mythic portrayal of them. And I actually think that opening and a lot of things in the movie kind of do wink at the audience and kind of let them know that. It's very cinematic and it's very like we're looking at visions of like an American past, which I think is what this movie is, rather than a biography of criminals that lived.
Yes, exactly.
And of course, what we should say right away, because everyone will say it in every book or anything you read about Bonnie and Clyde or any time podcast you listen to, they did not look like Warren Beatty and Mansfield. They were pasty. I actually think they were pretty cute, the real people, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrows, but they were short, kind of stout, pasty, sickly looking.
Yeah, they definitely did not look like Faye Dunaway or Warren Beatty, also known as some of the hottest people of the 60s.
Yeah. I mean, like, you could maybe say that Beatty looked a little bit like Clyde, but like the absolute most conventionally attractive version of Clyde.
Yeah, exactly. And then after the clip show, we get a very brief description of Bonnie and Clyde's lives beforehand. So Bonnie Parker was born in Rowena, Texas in 1910, and then moved to West Dallas. In 1931, she worked in a cafe before meeting Clyde and beginning her career in crime. And
that's where Taylor and I used to live.
Yes, very much so, absolutely. And Clyde was born to a family of sharecroppers. As a young man, he became a small-time thief and robbed a gas station. He served 2 years for armed robbery and was released on good behavior in 1931. And the very first actual scene we see, during the Great Depression, once again, Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker, Clyde Barrow played by Warren Beatty and Bonnie Parker once again played by Faye Dunaway of Texas, meet when Clyde tries to steal Bonnie's mother's car. Bonnie, who is bored by her job as a waitress, is intrigued by Clyde and decides to take up with him and become his partner in crime. They pull off some holdups, but their amateur efforts, while exciting, are not very lucrative. Bonnie and Clyde turn from small-time heists to bank robbing. Now, there are a couple funny scenes in there. So, of course, Clyde goes to a convenience store and he beats up a guy who tries to kill him. he gets $1.98 out of some store at some point. Like it's not very lucrative for them.
And this is one of the things too that is pretty realistic. It's highly, I don't know, made very cinematic, but it is true overall that by more serious bank robbers like John Dillinger and Babyface Nelson, that Bonnie and Clyde were not liked and they were not respected. They were sloppy. They didn't really make much money. They didn't seem, even this is a thing Dillinger claims to have said, they weren't trying to make like a living or for their future. They were messy. They were making more trouble for serious bank robbers. And a lot of those guys felt like they should have just stayed in Texas because they were making more problems for quote unquote more serious bank robbers, which is sort of a thing, at least in this early section of the film, that comes across. Kind of bored and reckless and not really career criminals so much as not thinking through, which I think is also
they're basically glorified thrill seekers more than actual professional criminals,
which is maybe sort of the thing that made the real people in their life, kind of celebrities and folk heroes. And also I think it's kind of what makes this movie so resonant with young people of the late 60s, that kind of driftwoodness.
Oh no, absolutely, for sure. But yes, the duo's crime spree shifts into high gear once they hook up with a dim-witted, and also in the original script, literally hook up with, but not in this version, a dim-witted gas station attendant, C.W. Moss, played by the actor Michael J. Pollard, who I learned actually one of his very last roles was in House of a Thousand Corpses. He played God, I think he played like I would have to look him up, but I remember who he was exactly. I think he was in the like one of the last scenes of the movie where he's like guiding the kids onto their ultimate deaths in House of a Thousand Corpses. Rest in peace. He died like 2 years after House of a Thousand Corpses came out, so
he went out on top.
Exactly.
And one of the things too with Taylor, as you alluded to, so Clyde in this movie was originally conceived as bisexual. Warren Beatty, I assume it was him, it could have been him. I nixed that. What ends up happening in the film and becomes sort of Bonnie and Clyde's arc in this movie is that Clyde is impotent. He just doesn't fuck. Now, there's a lot of things, there's a lot of licenses taken with reality that don't bother me in this movie because I think they serve the overall story and the themes that this movie is trying to show. But making Clyde impotent to me is a really weird choice because it is demonstrably false, like historically. Like Bonnie and Clyde, the real people, fucked all the time. They fucked in the back of cars, they fucked in front of people. And it just doesn't seem to me to add anything to, because this is a pretty romantic movie, to be honest. And that's one of the real things too you could say about Bonnie and Clyde is that they were deeply, deeply in love with each other. So for me, I'm not really sure what exactly making Clyde impotent is supposed to add to the experience.
Do you think I have a theory? So of course, as we've mentioned several times, that the Hays Code was still in effect. Do you think that?
I think I know where you're going.
Because this movie obviously has a shit ton of violence for 1967. In fact, almost on a pretty unprecedented level of violence for a movie for 1967. Yeah. Do you think it's just that they were like, well, we're getting away with this much violence. We don't want to risk too much with the sex, so we might as well just make them not fuck at all. You think maybe
there's that they could have wanted to tone down, because spoiler alert, that's Clyde's arc in this movie is, will he get to fuck? Will he be able to fuck? But my other thought, and this is tied into Taylor, your thing, is that still have the shadow of the Hays Code looming pretty large over Hollywood. And of course, one of the things with the Hays Code is that criminals always need to get their comeuppance, and they should be shown as cowardly deep down and not really tough. And I always was wondering, similarly, is it like, oh, we'll make him impotent because he's got that almost like, in sort of from a 60s perspective, maybe that makes him more effeminate or like less of a man, and so maybe it's like he's less glorified that way.
Yes. And also, as I mentioned earlier, C.W. Moss, in the original script, once again, Clyde was made bisexual, and C.W. Moss, Bonnie, and Clyde were all supposed to have a threesome. That was in the original script. That did not happen.
That way. They should have just kept it that way. They're already making stuff up. That would have been so much more interesting.
It would have been incredibly interesting, but it definitely, I don't know. That movie might not have made $70 million. I'll just say.
It's true.
I
don't know what you mean.
Yeah. But yes, their exploits also become more violent. After CW botches parking during a bank robbery and delays their escape, Clyde shoots the bank manager in the face when he jumps onto the slow-moving car's running board. Now, that was a scene that I did not expect in this movie because they shoot him in the face and it like goes through his mouth and you kind of see it. It's actually pretty gnarly.
Yeah. The violence, the gun violence in particular in this movie is rough. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it looks entirely realistic, but it looks, especially anatomically, it looks more detailed than anything in, a big studio crime film up to this point, I would say.
Oh no, absolutely. It is especially for 1967, some pretty wild shit. Next scene here is Clyde's older brother, Buck, once again played by Gene Hackman, and his wife, Blanche, played by Estelle Parsons. Now, as I mentioned to you earlier, Brian, Estelle Parsons actually won an Academy Award for her portrayal as Blanche in this movie, although the real-life Blanche, who is actually the only person still alive of the Barrow Gang by the time this movie came out, described Estelle Parsons' portrayal as, "That woman made me come out screaming like a horse's ass," because Blanche in this movie screams all the time.
She's awful. She's like,
she's really, like,
June.
Yeah, it's like, she's like just screaming constantly. My scream was way less annoying than hers. It is so annoying.
No, she's awesome in this movie. And I have no idea, the veracity of that. Of course, someone is going to say that about themselves. I tend, though, to believe that she's telling the truth and that she probably was not quite like that. There are stories about Bonnie Parker being annoyed with her or feeling like she was, soft, but you got to assume that maybe she wasn't quite as comically, irritating and scared all the time as this movie made her seem.
I'm going to assume that's probably the case too, but who knows, right? But yeah, she is a preacher's daughter, also joins the gang. The two women dislike each other at first sight, and their antipathy escalates. Blanche has nothing, once again, as you mentioned earlier, Blanche has nothing but disdain for Bonnie, Clyde, and CW, while Bonnie sees Blanche's flightiness as a constant danger to the gang's survival, which is objectively true. She is the weakest link by far of the gang. Not even a question. In Joplin, Missouri, local police drive to the hideout thinking the gang are bootleggers. Two policemen are killed in a shootout. Now, this is one of the more annoying scenes because during the shootout, which is actually a pretty good shootout, Blanche is screaming constantly throughout the scene. Constantly screaming. But they all end up getting away, but two policemen are killed in the shootout. The gang is pursued by law enforcement, including Texas Ranger Frank Hamer, played by the actor Denver Pyle, whom they capture and humiliate before setting him free. Now, Frank Hamer, in real life,
this is the best scene in the movie. It feels very like proto Tarantino to me.
Oh, very much so, yeah. Especially the scene, of course, in Reservoir Dogs where friend of the pod, Ray Liotta tortures that cop. But yeah, so that is a very Tarantino reminiscent scene. They tie him up, make him take a picture of them, and Bonnie kisses him. Fucking Frank Hamer spits in her face, and then they drown him for a little bit, and then put him in a boat, sending him off while they get away. So it's a little fun scene. Now, in real life, so the real life Frank Hamer was a Texas Ranger, just like in the movie. Although in this movie, they kind of make him out to be a little bit of a buffoon. But in real life, he was like one of the most feared officers in the entire country. I looked him up. Apparently, he killed extrajudicially because that was his job. He was basically the guy who just went out and just killed fucking criminals on the lam when before the FBI really formed. Frank Hamer killed up to 70 people extrajudicially.
Dear Lord.
Isn't that insane? That is insane.
That is nearly as many people as the number of dogs that the average police officer kills a year ago.
To be fair, that's a fraction of the amount that both George Santos and Pete Buttigieg have killed. So, I mean, those are rookie numbers if you ask me. But
that was before drone strikes.
Oh yeah, that's true. The five outlaws then pull a heist during which a police chase disables their vehicle. They steal Eugene Grizzard, aka Gene Wilder. Also, Brian, I think we may agree, Gene Wilder, fucking great. We love Gene Wilder.
Yeah, no, friend of the pod, Gene Wilder.
Absolutely. They steal his car and take him and his girlfriend hostage before quickly abandoning them when they learn he is an undertaker. The scene with Gene Wilder, and the scene with Frank Hamer are probably my favorite scenes in the whole movie.
Yeah, I would agree. Those are my two favorites. The whole thing with that too is, and this is a real thing, by the way. Not everyone who is kidnapped by the Barrow gang, but a not insignificant number of them did say, "Oh, they were fun. They were good people. Yeah, they held me up and they took my money or they took my car, but like they were good folks. I had a nice time with them." Not everyone said that, but a few people did. And the whole thing too, of course, with them dropping Law upon learning the Undertaker is that slowly and steadily, Bonnie's getting more kind of conscious of, her own mortality and kind of the realization that they're all going to die doing it, that this isn't a sustainable way to live. And that is another real thing that you see in Bonnie Parker's journal, is that she had a mounting kind of concern of the knowledge that they were going to die living this life. That she was never going to resume her normal life, that none of them, that wasn't the thing they could do. So I don't believe that there was any sort of undertaker, that they kidnapped. There are definitely people that they held up, that they drove around and got food with. I think that's a dramatization to show that Bonnie's at that point. But it's a good scene. It does turn on a dime because it's a very silly scene until then.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So, after, once again, the lovely scene with Gene Wilder, Bonnie wants to visit her family in Texas and give them part of the heist funds, to which Clyde reluctantly acquiesces despite the obvious risk. Now, this is a good scene, too, because you actually get to see Bonnie interact with other people other than the gang, and her mother is obviously not a big fan of Clyde. For obvious reasons. I mean, to be fair, meeting the in-laws can always be a little complicated, but this one's a little bit more complicated, I would say. And I'm not
entirely... This is actually a contender for my favorite scene. This really spells out, like, the phase of the movie we're in. It's kind of this dark, like, third act that we're entering, I think.
Yes, very much so. And I don't remember, I didn't list the actress who played Bonnie's mom, but she's also very good in this movie. I think she puts in a solid performance. The gang is caught off guard by an ambush by law enforcement overnight, resulting in many casualties, including Buck, who is accidentally shot in the head during the getaway. Blanche is injured in one of her eyes, losing sight. And she is caught the next morning, right? So, Bonnie, Clyde, and CW barely escape alive. While Blanche falls into police custody. Hamer then tricks her into revealing CW's name. Until then, he was only known as an unidentified suspect by the police. I like that scene a lot where they catch her and she gets they get all the information out of her, because that's the last scene she's in. So I don't have to hear her scream anymore. It's great. Honestly, the fact she won,
did her dirty, the real person in this movie.
Oh no, for sure, absolutely. And I don't know what it is. I think she's the worst part of this movie. I'm surprised she got an Academy Award. She's awful in this movie. I don't think it's the actress's fault, but
no, the actress is great. Everyone, every performance in this movie is great, but they wrote her to be an annoying character. Like, I do want to say that for the most part, I feel like this movie pretty unambiguously writes Bonnie and Clyde as sympathetic and as anti-heroes a lot more than later movies like this would. There's still some ambiguity there. You see that one of the things, to elaborate, going back a bit, when the scene with Bonnie's mother, her real issue with Clyde is not so much, it doesn't seem like that she has some deep moral opposition to him robbing a bank, because nobody really does. This is, Depression era, and this is kind of, they keep referring to hard times. There's a scene early on alluding to, Bonnie and Clyde interact with a family who have lost their home because the bank gets foreclosed on it, and Clyde, very kind of triumphantly announces, "We rob banks," and the family likes hearing that. But Bonnie's mother's issue is that they're going to die like this, because Clyde says, trying to be, a good son-in-law and trying to, ingratiate himself to Bonnie's mother. "Oh, when this is all over, when the hard times are over, we're going to settle down and we're going to live, but 3 miles away from you." And Bonnie's mother has one of my favorite leads of the whole movie, where she says, "Oh, if you lived 3 miles from me, you would be dead, soon." And, says, "You'd better keep moving," and you know it too. Because, of course, Clyde does know that. He knows there's no world where he and Bonnie really are going to be able to get married and stop robbing banks and just live near Bonnie's mother. It's all alive, and he's telling her, and probably that he's telling himself too.
Oh, no, very much so. Hamer finds Bonnie, Clyde, and CW hiding at the house of CW's father, Ivan, played by the actor Dub Taylor. He's also great in this movie. He is obviously not very happy with his dumbass son getting involved in this bullshit. And in this movie, he's ultimately the one that helps set the ambush for Bonnie and Clyde that Hamer ends up organizing, which, of course, in real life, Hamer and his gang were the ones who killed Bonnie and Clyde.
This is an interesting character because there are some parallels to Bonnie's mother, but it's sort of the opposite thing. CW's father is, kind of this, an even cruder man than, say, the Barrows are. They could be fairly crude. He's crass, and kind of, there's sort of some implication that he doesn't like the Barrows because CW listens to them and respects them and not him. He has a line where he says, "You don't even get your name in the paper." So he's kind of mad that, they're getting this adulation. It's not quite the same drive to dislike as, say, Bonnie's mother has towards Clyde, although it might seem that way at first. Mm-hmm. They're making this a character like a sleazy, spineless character that you can hate. There may be some moral ambiguity here, but in terms of Bonnie and Clyde's death, the producers want you to see this as an act of spineless, reactionary society, murdering two kind of wild and free spirits. Now, whether or not we agree with that is a more complicated story, but that is definitely the narrative that the movie is sort of framing around.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. No, I definitely agree with that. The elder Moss strikes a bargain with Hamer, once again. In exchange for leniency for CW, he sets a trap for the outlaws. Now, before we get into the final conclusion of this story, there is a poem that Bonnie writes that was actually featured in a newspaper in real life. Now, I actually do have the poem up, so Brian, if you don't mind, I will go over the poem real quick.
Yeah, it's so wonderful.
So the poem is, once again, written by Bonnie. It is, "You have read the story of Jesse James, of how he lived and died. If you are still in need of something to read, here is the story of Bonnie and Clyde. Now Bonnie and Clyde are the Barrow gang. I'm sure you all have read how they rob and steal, and how those who squeal are usually found dying or dead. There are lots of untruth to their write-ups. They're not so merciless as that. They hate all the laws, the stool pigeons, spotters, and rats. They class them as cold-blooded killers. They say they are heartless and mean. But I say this with pride, that I once knew Clyde when he was honest, upright, and clean. But the law fooled around, kept taking him down and locking him up in a cell till he said to me, I will never be free. So I will meet a few of them in heaven. This road was so dimly lighted, there was no highway signs to guide. But they made up their minds, if the roads were all blind, they wouldn't give up until they died. The road gets dimmer and dimmer. Sometimes you can hardly see. Still, it's fight man to man and do all you can, for they know they can never be free. If they try to act like citizens and rent them a nice little flat, about the third night they are invited to fight by a submachine gun. Rat-tat-tat. If a policeman is killed in Dallas, and they have no clues for a guide, if they can't find a friend, they just wipe the slate clean and hang it on Bonnie and Clyde. 2 crimes have been done in America, not accredited to the Barrow mob, for they had no hand in the kidnapping demand or the Kansas City depot, or was it department job? I think that's the word. Sorry, it's a little blurry here. A newsboy once said to his buddy, I wished old Clyde would get jumped in this awful hard times if we might make a few dimes if 5 or 6 laws get bumped. The police haven't got the report yet. Clyde sent a wireless today saying, we have a peace flag of white. We stretch it out at night. We have joined the NRA. They don't think they are too tough or desperate. They know the law always wins. They have been shot at before, but they do not ignore that death was the wages of sin. From heartbreaks, some people have suffered. From weariness, some people have died. But take it all in all, our troubles are small until we get like Bonnie and Clyde. Someday we will go down together, and they will bury them side by side. To a few it means grief, to the law it is relief, but it is the death to Bonnie and Clyde. And that's it. That's it.
As a first-hand document, this is really interesting because it's really hard, I think, to fathom we're so deep in like internet and social media, and I don't mean to sound corny about it. Kind of modern folk heroes like Bonnie and Clyde, where what's portrayed in this movie, where they're kind of gathered around and they're treated like celebrities. I mean, that really happened. There were people that bought papers every day to read about Bonnie and Clyde, to try to follow newspapers, tried to follow their exploits, kind of like, like you follow like a TV show or something like that. I mean, and a lot of it has to do with how poor a lot of the country was and how, there's always this love of outlaws and things. And, again, there's murky, half-truths to it and things. But it's really hard to imagine that now, and I do think this movie captures it really well, more than the movie ever could. That's an actual poem found in that vehicle, in Bonnie Parker's notebook. I don't know how true it is. There's a lot of pretty dark implications if you take it at face value. It is pretty true that there were a lot of crimes attributed to Bonnie and Clyde over a pretty large swath of the country, that it's hard to believe they could have committed them all. I'm sort of inclined to believe that the truth is somewhere in the middle, that there's still a lot of stuff that they did. And then, maybe there's a lot of stuff that they didn't do that, lazy cops just hug on them. It's pretty, I think I was thinking about it last night too. To have as, her own artifact, to have that poem as a thing that does outline everything that was going on around them, because it was like a moment in American history, and it was this moment where a lot of people were feeling desperate. And
very much so.
There's that line in the poem about Clyde saying, "I'll never be free, so I'll meet a few of them in hell." One of the big things that in Clyde Barrows and his brothers' upbringing was they did grow up very working class religious, like kind of brutally so. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that they were taught, that a lot of people were taught, is that it's righteous and pious and godly to be very, very poor. And that the rich are inherently sinful. I'm kind of inclined to think that this became a popular talking point at the time and that it was sort of spread by rich people to be passed down to poor people, to kind of keep them from trying to elevate their station.
I actually very much agree with that. It often reminds me of like, oh yeah, it's actually really bad to be rich. You definitely don't want to be rich while they're like,
we've got, trust me, this shit sucks.
Yeah, no, I was honestly, the second before you said that, I was thinking of fucking Walk Hard. I was thinking that.
You don't want no part of this shit.
Yeah, it's like wealth. You don't want any of this shit while he's like holding gold coins in the corner. Like,
knowing that too, I think about his upbringing does explain a lot about the Barrows. This sort of like, it's always kind of indicated that Clyde had a lot of contempt for banks, for people he perceived as upper class, and for cops especially. And I think that even though he, by his own account, was not really religious, as he got older, it's interesting to learn that was a fundamental part of his childhood, and that a part of his parents' belief structure was that it's righteous to be poor, and that it's, sinful to be wealthy or whatever.
No, for sure. But yes, on to the last scene here. When Bonnie and Clyde stop on the side of the road to help Mr. Moss fix a flat tire, the police in the bushes open fire and riddle them with bullets. Now, literally do riddle them with bullets. It lasts about 30 seconds or so, maybe even a full minute. It lasts a long time, where they just like fucking Tommy gun these guys, both Bonnie and Clyde, and just, they must have hit them with 50. I mean, in real life, they literally did do this. Because you see the damage after the car, and they basically turn Bonnie and Clyde into fucking ground beef.
Yeah, they're
so it's pretty ruthless. Hamer and his posse come out of hiding and look pensively at the couple's bodies as a nearby flock of swallows flies away. And that's the end of the movie. Which, to be fair, once again, that is how the story of Bonnie and Clyde ended. They got ambushed by Hamer and his gang, and they got riddled with bullets and died.
And just to revisit one more big falsehood in the movie, towards the end, intercut, before we see them get shot, we've already talked about how this film sets up Clyde as impotent. So in their final days, there's sort of like a growth period, right, where Clyde is considering ways that they could, maybe that they could live differently. At no point when he talks about these does he talk about stopping robbing banks, which kind of indicates to me that he's not that serious.
Yeah.
But it's at least that and I think the idea to me is actually that he's pretty aware that he's going to die soon, and he's sort of fantasizing about what he could do as opposed to making a plan. But in this period where it's kind of that, again, the way I read this is that he's kind of finding some sort of peace with the fact that they're going to die soon. But Bonnie and Clyde fuck. There's been a couple attempts at them fucking where, they can't because Clyde doesn't fuck. Because his dick doesn't work.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty stupid. It's one of the only things about this movie that really frustrates me. Because the idea, I think, is because, again, this movie is sort of, it's setting Bonnie and Clyde up as complicated heroes, but it is setting them up heroically, which I'm fine with. It's a movie. I don't care. But I think it wants to give them a happy ending, knowing that it has to kill them. It has to have them brutally mowed down.
Very much so.
Thinking, well, we'll have Clyde be impotent, and they never get to fuck, but then shortly before they die, like, there's some sort of switch happens, and they can finally really make love. To me, that sucks. Because that never happened. I'm serious. I mean, I think that was the logic. It's like, oh, now they have a nice happy ending where it's like, oh, they were in love. They finally got to fuck. But the truth of it is that they fucked over the time. That would have been a way cooler movie if they were fucking plowing in the back of the getaway car with CW just tearing ass through a cornfield.
It would have, but obviously the times were the times, unfortunately. But yeah, no, totally. I totally agree with all that. I wish they had shown, honestly, full penetration. I think that would have been very accurate.
I mean, check and see if there's any similar films, any other versions of Bonnie and Clyde very well.
No, that might be in this European release or something. But yes.
From the director's cut, yeah.
Yeah. All right, let's get into some Amazon reviews real quick before our final thoughts here. Now, I found some good ones, though, to be fair. I found some pretty good reviews. First review is from David Baldwin, who gives this film 5 stars. And the header of the review says, landmark of American cinema. 1967 was a watershed year for American film. The Best Picture nominees were, once again, Bonnie and Clyde, In the Heat of the Night, The Graduate, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and Dr. Dolittle and In Cold Blood weren't nominated.
It's so awesome Dr. Dolittle is in there. Like anyone gives it.
No, I thought that was funny too, but Bonnie and Clyde was unlike any film that came before, and that may account for its spotty reception upon initial release. Is the film a treatise on the nature of violence? Is it a commentary on misguided hero worship? Whatever. It's a damn good movie. I agree with that. It's a damn good movie.
It's
Bonnie,
I think it's kind of all those things, but I do think I also take it more at face value maybe than this reviewer does.
Oh no, for sure. Bonnie and Clyde may not have influenced Peckinpah, but it sure anticipated him. Director Arthur Penn does a terrific job of evoking the Great Depression, a time when it would be perfectly understandable for the mass public to embrace antisocial misfits like the Barrow Gang. Well, it's a very desperate time. Desperate times call for desperate measures. You know what I mean?
There really isn't any reason if you're a fucking dirt farmer in Arkansas reading the newspaper to not sympathize with the Barrow Gang.
Oh,
especially
no, for sure.
If you read accounts from people they fucking kidnapped saying, "Oh, they bought me food and they had a good old time and they dropped me off at home." Which,
yeah.
Again, not every person they kidnapped said that. I don't get mad at me, but a good chunk of people that they kidnapped accounted it that way.
There's even a little montage in the movie where they have people say that too. They're like, "Oh, yeah, it was fine, I guess. He took my money, but he wasn't that bad."
Yeah. And at first, that's we kind of, we talked about the scene with Hamer, but they say there is that scene where it's either Clyde or Buck. It must be Clyde because they wouldn't have given such a good bad to Buck. So it's like, oh, you're supposed to be back in Texas protecting the rights of poor people, and you're out here chasing us. It's pretty on the nose, but I think it sums up pretty well why so many people in the film and in real life sympathize with Bonnie and Clyde.
Oh, no, for sure. Warren Beatty projects aw shucks geniality as Clyde, a man who knows how to handle a 6-shooter, but shoots blanks in the bedroom. That was really good. Faye Dunaway is sensuous as Bonnie, a waitress who joins Clyde not so much for altruistic reasons, but more for thrill-seeking. A terrific supporting cast includes Gene Hackman as Clyde's brother along for the ride, Buck's wife Estelle Parsons as Blanche, and Michael J. Pollard as the lazy, gated mechanic who relishes the opportunity to rub elbows with notoriety. Bonnie and Clyde hasn't dated one iota from 1967 and is definitely deserving of its status in the American film pantheon. Now, I think you did mention earlier that this is almost kind of like a modern movie to a certain extent, and I will agree with that.
I think if you watch it now, it still feels pretty cutting edge. There, aside again, to me, some of the impotent stuff is a little silly watching it now, but outside of that, it feels very much.
Very much so. Now, this review I actually found is actually a review from 1999. So this is a pretty old Amazon review. But it is a good review. Mr. or Miss, I'm not entirely sure. R. Geets gives this film 4 stars. And the header of the review says, still a classic, but see it in context. The body of the review says, I remember going to the theater as an impressionable teenager in 1967 and sitting through this movie 5 times. This person saw this movie 5 times in the theaters. That's how, we were talking about how this was like a monoculture movie, how everybody saw it. This person saw it 5 fucking times in 1967. I
see that though. That if you've never, I assume, you've never seen anything like this. And you don't have home video. You don't see movies on TV. You don't know when you're gonna see something like this again.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I definitely understand it. Next sentence is, I think it's probably hard for younger viewers to understand why Bonnie and Clyde made such an impact. There were big debates among critics at the time. There's even a case where one of the weekly magazine critics panned it one week and changed his mind and praised it the next. Part of the furor was over how it portrayed violence and violent characters and how it mixed comedy and drama. Early in the film, in one of their comically botched holdups, Clyde shoots a man point blank in the face through a car window. That was incredibly shocking at the time. Nothing had been seen like that before, and it was being done by a character we had been set up to like. From this point in time, the movie looks pretty tame, maybe even a bit naive. The locations and scenic design are still outstanding, which makes the widescreen DVD all the more appreciated. Although Bonnie, especially her hair, looks more like a product of the 60s and the 30s. That is objectively true. And the finely edited Dance of Death at the end remains strangely beautiful and horrifying at the same time. P.S. And keep in mind, this is a fictionalized account. It wasn't meant to be a documentary. Now, another thing, this is another connection that both this movie and Born Losers have in common, is the very end last death scene are both very artistically done in both those movies. Because like the Danny Masterson character in Born Losers dies a very fucking maybe even like a Kurosawa death. I think that was like kind of reminiscent of what that was, like a very theatrical kind of death. And of course, Bonnie and Clyde die very theatrically in this movie too.
I wish we had the song clip, if you can put it in actually. Trump saying he died like a dog, like a coward. That would be really happy.
If you can find a specific clip, I definitely will put that in.
I can. I know I can find you the clip. I haven't.
Excellent. I'll put it probably right here. Okay, good. The next review from Mr. I don't know if this is Mick or MC, but I'm going to call him Mick Rock 231. They give this film 1 star, and the title of the review is Factually Inaccurate. The body of the review says, this had to be one of the worst movies by the way, worse, not worst, worst movies I have ever seen. Bonnie and Clyde were 2 cold-blooded killers who got what they deserved. And I do believe this movie shows how liberal Hollywood was becoming during this time period.
Sure, I guess.
Frank Hammer, they also misspell his name, as they do in the movie. It was Frank Hamer, but this guy calls him Frank Hammer. Character and story was completely incorrect. The historians who were hired for this movie failed. But then again, I wouldn't be surprised if they only hired socialists to push a narrative against law enforcement.
They hired socialists.
I mean, to be fair, Warren Beatty is like a soft socialist. So, I mean...
Yeah. But I mean, like, they didn't... I don't know. Like, it's very funny to be... This person, like, 100 years old, like, this movie is so... Like, it's a movie about, like, bank robbers. I don't know, man.
Yeah, also bank robbers who die at the end. Like, they get their comeuppance. Like,
it pretty much follows the Hays Code. Well, I guess it doesn't, because it makes them look very cool and funny and nice, you know.
Yeah. Although, interestingly enough, I mean, once again, going back to Bulworth is maybe one of the most left-wing, like, Academy Award nominated films of all time. Once again, Bulworth is in the drive, Brian. You have to watch Bulworth. It is incredible. It is so good.
I'll take Kratom and I'll watch it tonight.
If you've ever wanted to see Halle Berry give a nearly 70-year-old Warren Beatty an N-word pass, that is the movie for you.
Sounds awesome.
Oh God, yeah. And also, I'm sure you've definitely heard of the Gangsta Boo Chapo Trap House review of Bulworth, right?
But because I'd never seen the movie, none of it really stuck. You know what I mean? You know when you listen to a podcast about a movie you haven't seen, and it's hard for you to really...
No,
follow.
Yeah. And also, Chapo, if you're around, we reviewed the movie first. We reviewed the movie months before they reviewed Bulworth, but that's okay. That's fine. Who cares?
For real, Taylor has been talking to me about Bulworth for 10 years. I bet.
No, actually, so that's not quite true. I first watched Bulworth probably about 2 or 3 years ago, actually. I became obsessed with... No, I became obsessed with Bulworth after I watched Todd in the Shadow's review of the Praz Michael song, Ghetto Superstar, which was the actual, like, that was like the main song from the soundtrack of Bulworth, was that song. And it actually includes Warren Beatty in it. It's a good song. I like that song quite a bit. It's also got ODB on it. I mean, you know.
Oh my God. What the fuck is this movie?
Yeah, no. See, I mean, the soundtrack for Bulworth is fucking incredible. Like, it is the who's who of fucking late '90s rap. I think it's got Wu-Tang on it too, if I'm not mistaken.
If it's at DB, probably.
Yeah, it's got Dr. Dre and LL Cool J. Once again, Pros Michael and ODB and Maya. It's got Method Man and a couple other people on there. It's got RZA. So it's got like 3 members already of fucking. It's got Ice Cube on it. The Black Eyed Peas before they became famous. Public Enemy. It's got so many. This movie's fucking amazing. You have to watch Bulworth.
I do.
Okay, so finally, that was way off track. But the very last review here is from the user Wheelin' Billy, like a word wheel in Billy, who gives it 5 stars. And the header of the review says, the most famous of the Bonnie and Clyde movies. A great movie, not a realistic portrayal of the true Bonnie and Clyde. A lot of actual portrayals of them, but Hollywood dramatized. Storyline of their life of crime, but not their real characterization. It's a good movie to watch with great stars. That's a pretty good summation of my feelings on this movie. It's not realistic. It's a great movie, not realistic, but it's a good movie with great stars.
But it is truly a film full of celebs, and we love to see them.
We love our stars, people. Absolutely fantastic. But yes, that is my last review here. So we have a couple minutes left before this old-ass millennial has to go to bed. Brian, what are your final thoughts on Bonnie and Clyde?
If you are an old millennial, because I don't think people really talk about this movie as much as they do, or did in the past. It's kind of fallen by the wayside. If you need like a movie that is genuinely pretty romantic and pretty fun to watch, and you want something different for Valentine's Day, this isn't a bad option. In fact, the Valentine's Day project I'm doing that this intersects with is a marathon of movies about couples that are genuinely and deeply in love that go on murderous screeds. But this is probably the best of them. This one and then True Romance, made about 30 years later, are your 2 best options for that. I highly recommend.
Yes, I highly recommend this. And I will say, out of the 2 1967 movies that you've chosen that feature alumni of Washington High School in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and also end in very artistic deaths, this is definitely my favorite of those 2, I would say, by quite a bit. I liked Born Losers, but I did like this movie quite a bit more.
No, this is just a great movie. This is kind of essential American cinema viewing, especially if you're interested in this period in the 60s where kind of more anti-authority subtext is still coming out. This is a really pivotal movie in that development.
Absolutely. Yeah, without this movie, we probably would be living in a probably fairly different Hollywood landscape right now. Or I should say movies like this, at the very least.
Yeah, no, without question.
So, but yes, this is going to be Taylor signing off here.
Have a good night, everyone.
Absolutely. And if you want to follow us, you can follow me at Carlos Chantor on Twitter.com. And Brian, if you want to plug your Twitter, because we barely ever do that.
Oh, yeah, you can follow me at John Stab. That's JONSTABB. I stole that name from a dead guy on Twitter. Don't follow me anywhere else. Don't parasocial.
Same. Do not follow me anywhere else. Do not refer to me. I have no pronouns. I refuse to have any pronouns at all. Do not refer to me. I'm not even transphobic. Just do not refer to me as anything, frankly. You can follow me on Twitter, but that is it. So,
you don't anyway, so it's fine.
Yeah. All right. Have a good night, everybody.